Welcome to the Nuances Podcast, where we expand our understanding of what it means to be part of the Asian diaspora. With every guest, we explore our often multi-hyphenated identities, our complicated relationships with our cultures, and how they affect everything from our career choices to our views on anti-racism, disability justice, religion, feminism, LGBTQ+ rights, and more. I'm your host, Lazu, a new American who grew up in the only place a dodo bird ever lived, Mauritius. Before we get into our conversation with Cherie, here are some definitions. Merch refers to merchandise that artists sell as part of their brand. T-shirts, mugs, stickers, posters, and vinyl are common merch items for musicians. A bear market is a market in which prices are falling, which encourages selling. A beat in journalism refers to an area of specialization for reporters where their news-gathering efforts are focused on specific subjects or locations. Cherie's beat is the intersection of music, tech, and culture from a music industry standpoint. Given Cherie's beat, we do have a few technical terms which I will define quickly, but if you're tech savvy, feel free to skip ahead 2 minutes. For all of the technical terms that we mentioned today, they're all mentioned in passing, so even if you don't really know them or understand them, you will still be able to follow this conversation, so don't be intimidated. IRL events stands for in real life. They are events that happen in real life as opposed to virtually. AI is artificial intelligence. I'm sure you know that already. ChatGPT is an AI chatbot, and it's notable for enabling users to refine and steer a conversation towards a desired length, format, style, level of detail, and language. Midjourney is a similar AI tool, but that generates pictures based on text prompts. So you could say, draw me a unicorn in outer space, and it will do that. Deepfakes are synthetic media that have been digitally manipulated to impersonate someone's likeness convincingly. So one thing that you might have heard about is a song that was a deepfake of Drake and The Weeknd. They didn't actually make that song, but using AI, somebody created a song that sounded like it was from them. A DAW, or DAW, is a digital audio workstation. It's software that you use to record music. Some examples are Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton. I'm using Logic to record this podcast right now. Splice is a cloud-based music creation platform, mostly known for its sample library, which contains various sounds that you can download to use and create music. Blockchain is a method of recording information that makes it impossible or difficult for the system to be changed, hacked, or manipulated. A blockchain is a distributed ledger that duplicates and distributes transactions across the network of computers that are participating in the blockchain. Crypto is short for cryptocurrency, which is based off of the blockchain technology. And NFT means non-fungible token, which is also based on blockchain technology. I've included a link to a guide that can explain this whole thing a lot better than I can. So if you're interested in understanding more of that, go to the show notes. There's a link there. Now on to our conversation with Cherie. Our guest today is Cherie Hu. Cherie is the founder of the music tech research organization, Water and Music. Water and Music's mission is to make the music industry more innovative, cooperative, and transparent by building a collaborative data and education hub that consistently beats the market on identifying trends in music, technology, and culture. Previously, Cherie penned hundreds of articles on music and tech as a freelance writer for publications including Billboard, Forbes, Pitchfork, and Variety. She has spoken as an expert commentator on CNBC and SiriusXM Volume, as a guest lecturer at institutions like Harvard University, New York University, and Northeastern University, and as a moderator, panelist, or keynoter at over 30 conferences worldwide. Thank you so much for being here, Cherie. It's nice to meet you.
Yeah, great to meet you. Thanks for having me.
So let's start from the beginning. You grew up on the East Coast. So what was that like growing up Asian American on the East Coast?
Very suburban and very both busy and chill at the same time. So I grew up in Westchester County in New York, very suburban county for the most part, just an hour outside of New York City. Growing up, I was a middle child. A lot of that was stereotypical in a good way. I was just chilling around, doing my own thing. I think it definitely impacted my personality even today in terms of how I live my life. But growing up, I was really into piano specifically. I started taking piano lessons because my older sister was taking them, but really just enjoyed the experience. Like I wasn't forced to continue it, but that ended up being my main extracurricular activity went to pre-college programs for music in New York City throughout middle and high school. That was a big part of my life. And then academically, I was really into all kinds of things, but definitely, especially into math. So that ended up defining a lot of my academic career. I was blessed to, all things considered, be like a pretty chill household. I ended up traveling a lot with family also. So yeah.
Awesome. So did you have a lot of other Asian Americans in your neighborhood at school, or were you the only one? What was that like?
I wasn't the only one, but Asians were definitely in the small minority in my year. That said, things have changed pretty drastically in my town, Scarsdale. I actually just visited recently, and the local Chinese association donated a whole room to the public library. Like you walk in and like on the left side, there's a whole conference room, I think, that has their name on it. That would not have happened growing up. Like there were a handful of other Chinese families, and the Chinese families in particular would get together and host these parties around holidays and stuff. But yeah, in my year, probably like 10 to 20 people max who are of Asian descent that I knew of. I definitely was aware of it, but I never felt excluded from anything specifically for being a minority.
That's great. Yeah, we had a lot of guests who said that they were the only Asian kid or one of two or three. And then people would make weird comments about their food and all the things that they bring at school and all that. So,
I mean, this actually has become a lot more apparent living in New York City and staying in New York City on my own or like living independently over the holidays. For example, a stereotype that I think is true and good and like hopefully acceptable is that a lot of Jewish families will eat Chinese food on Christmas.
Yeah.
Like they go out to like Chinese restaurants and just give them business, which is awesome. So the town I lived in, I don't know if it was majority Jewish, but Jewish, it was like one of the top groups represented in the town. So little cultural things like that, I think helped in that Chinese food and culture was just a huge part of kind of month to month living in the city. So yeah, it was never seen as a weird thing. Just like, oh yeah, let's go celebrate and hang out and enjoy this food.
Yeah. So in another podcast interview, you mentioned that you were considering going to Juilliard for piano, but then ended up majoring in stats. Did your parents try to sway you one way or the other, or were they cool with you pursuing an artistic path as well?
It was a little mixed, but definitely they wanted like a more stable career for me, which is a very common thread, I think, for any Asian person or any person from an immigrant family or immigrant parents. It's like an almost universal thread. Yeah, so there definitely was some back and forth about that. In my summer after sophomore and junior year of high school, did a summer music festival and just like study program called the Aspen Music Festival. It's in Aspen, Colorado. And it was so idyllic, if that's the right word. Like it was in the middle of the Aspen Mountains and like you could hike after practicing for a little bit in the morning and there's surrounded by nature. And after that second summer, I was like, I want to do piano. This sounds like the dream. I know I want to like commit my life to this because I was deciding whether or not to do the whole conservatory audition process, which is very intense senior year. And it was actually my own piano teacher at the time. I was so surprised. And we sat down during a lesson and I told her this whole thing. I was like, I was thinking about it. I loved Aspen Festival and I think I want to do this full time. And the first thing that she said was, the life of a musician is not that. You're not going to be in the middle of the woods, just like dreaming, not having a care in the world, just playing. Like, no, it is very brutal. So we had actually a very long talk of like, before you go in, be very realistic about what you're going into. I'm actually really glad that she told me that. We had that conversation. And it's not like I've given up on music. I'm much more heavily involved, at least in the industry side, than I certainly ever thought I would be. But it was a good wake-up call of, it's definitely good to have dreams for sure and to like pursue them. But when thinking about like a career and preparing for everything that's to come, being realistic about the challenges, I think that's been very helpful.
Yeah. So when did your interest in journalism start?
It was very random. So growing up, I guess, big part of my childhood was I loved writing, but in a very recreational way. So I was definitely the kind of person to like have a bunch of ideas and want to write a bunch of novels, but never finish them. There are so many different notebooks at home, probably still at home, with chapter 1 of a novel that I guess ended up not finishing. So I was like, here's another idea. Let's explore this other rabbit hole. But I was really into creative writing. So yeah, aside from math, which was my main thing academically, we had a mini publishing center at my school, like elementary school. And I was like super into that, like writing stories, making my own books.
That's cool.
Yeah, but throughout high school, throughout college, I did write like an arts column for my school paper. And I wrote my own blog on WordPress, but it was just bullet point thoughts, certainly not professional journalism by any means. At that same time, my interest was crystallizing in music and tech. That's something I wanted to explore. And I think it was specifically looking at opportunities at the intersection of music and data analysis. So how can I apply my skills to solving a problem that I was becoming more aware was a thing in the industry? There just being so much data being generated, so much music being consumed. And at the time, like 2013 to 2017, there not being that many tools, at least sophisticated tools like we have today, to analyze what's happening. So yeah, I did a couple of internships on the side there, started blogging a little bit on my own blog about music tech trends that I was seeing. And then very randomly at a media career fair, happened to meet an editor at Forbes magazine who happened to be looking for more contributors to cover music and tech for their entertainment section. Because at that time, this was 2015. Spotify was really just starting to become super popular in the US. Apple Music had just launched. So there are a lot of big tech companies now entering the streaming era and a lot of competition. And they wanted to have someone to cover that and also cover other music startups that were emerging. And I handed over my resume, and the editor very thankfully was like, this sounds really interesting and like a really good fit. You should send in samples. And my samples were just this column I wrote it's like an arts column for the school paper, which was just interviewing artists. It wasn't writing about the music business, and my own blog. And very, very thankfully, this person like took a chance on me in this very serendipitous encounter that I just was not expecting. And yes, very thankfully, I got a gig to write a few articles a month for their entertainment section, just about music and tech. And two things. One, everything I learned about journalism and reporting, I learned on the job. Absolutely. I actually took my first journalism class after starting to freelance write, because I was like, oh, it actually probably would be helpful to have context on how we got here in terms of practices in media. So I took a political journalism seminar that was super illuminating. But vast majority of things I learned, I did on the job. Second thing is I stuck with writing. So I was still exploring what's the best way to express my interest in music and tech. And I dove into writing as maybe an option. I've stuck with it ever since, or I've stuck with media ever since, because I realized an opportunity to carve out a niche for myself in a topic like music and tech that actually is not niche at all. If you zoom out and look at what music and tech encapsulates, it is arguably the entire music industry, or it touches the entire music industry, and therefore it touches pop culture. What's at stake if you really zoom out culturally is so vast. But in terms of people or publications who were really focused on that angle on culture and on the industry, even today, there aren't that many writers who are focusing on that specifically. So yeah, as someone who's trying to think about my career long-term, I saw a really interesting opportunity to at least contribute in a small way to the conversation. And thankfully, as my articles got out, I got that same feedback from people and just kept writing, growing a community around it. And the rest is recent history.
Yeah. So when you were writing for Forbes and all these other publications, were they giving you topics that they wanted you to explore, or were you given free rein to write whatever you thought was important to cover?
It was a mix. At first, definitely there was some feedback from editing teams I was working with, just because I was very new to it. Oh, and if I were like pitching to a publication for the first time, for sure, they would have to approve the topic first, like through a cold email. But after a while, the Forbes contributor model is really distinct in that once you are approved as a contributor in their network, usually you have very wide editorial flexibility. I know this can sometimes be contentious because that just leads to seemingly random stuff being on the site that shouldn't be there. But it was the best situation to be in as a budding writer who was trying to like make her way through the industry, just write about whatever. Early on, also, having not had a really big professional portfolio of writing, I think subconsciously I gravitated towards interviewing a lot of founders, trying to cover the startup landscape. One, just because I thought that perspective was really interesting, and also because those people were more likely to respond to press interview requests, because most of them are just always trying to get their story out and get some kind of mention. So it's a perfect mutually beneficial relationship early in my career to talk to these founders and just learn about their perspective. And thankfully, as part of this Forbes gig, but also a lot of other pieces I was writing, a lot of people were trying to capture that perspective. And that's proven very valuable. It proved very valuable then and still now. Like that is very much our focus with Water Music now, the company I run. Yeah. So I was very blessed like early on to have a lot of free reign relative to what is expected in the freelance writing world.
Yeah. So one of the things that really struck me when I first read one of your articles was how detail oriented it was. And I feel like a lot of the music publications I've read, they're wishy-washy. And I feel like part of it might be that there isn't that really solid understanding of the tech, or maybe they feel like the audience that they have as a readership will not get it, or it will be too involved. So I was wondering, did you ever get pushback from any of those publications in terms of, oh, we think this is too complicated and we need to simplify it and make it more accessible?
Yeah, this is interesting question. I think it definitely depends on the publication. For more mainstream publications, for sure, from my experience, the way that a lot of those contracts are structured is essentially like a work for hire. They're paying you to write articles that they believe will help their business, help their site, get an audience. Like, you do have to meet somewhere in the middle in terms of serving their audience. So yeah, that has definitely come up of like in pitching articles, for instance, needing to make sure that if it's a more mainstream publication like a Billboard or Variety or Pitchfork, making sure it can speak to a more general audience or is more accessible to people who might be music fans but not know as much about technology. That's definitely not the voice that I lean into now, which is very much down the rabbit hole, very deep into the tech. But I'm very glad I got that kind of training, because especially if you're in the position of trying to grow a brand or like trying to communicate, I run into this all the time to like my family or my friends who are not in the industry of what's actually going on. Being familiar with that language and like how to talk about what's happening in a very niche area in a way that still has mainstream appeal is still a really good balance to have some practice in striking. But I definitely ran into that, but it never felt an outwardly negative thing. Oh God, I have to pander to these people. It was just, I guess it's just part of the relationship. If you're writing for this publication, there is a balance between making sure your own voice comes out as a writer, but then also the publication does have their own voice and their own audience. And so I guess freelance writing, if done well, it gives you exposure to a lot of different kinds of audiences and understanding of their perspective on the industry. So it was really good to get that as well.
So you are the person who can explain crypto to my grandma.
Oh, I don't know if I've nailed it quite yet, but I've tried. I've been in that situation many times. So yes, maybe one day I will get the chance.
You mentioned in one of your interviews that you go out of your way to include the artist's perspective in your reporting, and that you noticed that a lot of times they were left out of those conversations, even though that very much affects their bottom line. When did you start to notice that the artists weren't being consulted?
That they were not being included in articles? I think it was very instructive thinking about this question that for the vast majority of my waking years, my relationship to music has been through a genre like classical that is usually left out of any industry conversation. And not only that, every year there seems to be a new article. Is classical music dying? Is classical music dead? In some cases, accurately so, there's fears of audiences dwindling. It's not getting that many streams. Like, what's the future of the economics of being a classical artist? And then I do have some friends who've gone through the conservatory system, are full-time musicians, and some are doing really well. Others are really struggling. It's a very difficult career, as with any music career, as an artist, to really keep up. So I think just early on, not even thinking about working in the music industry prior to college growing up, I was exposed to a lot of those dynamics. And then when I started writing more and reading more about the music industry and seeing one of my pet peeves in the thought leadership world, I guess, or like the industry B2B media world is like anytime someone publishes something and says, this is the solution. This is the way to grow your audience. This is the way to make all your money as an artist. I haven't grown up in a classical world that has just such a different model from almost any other genre that's out there. My radar for that kind of claim was really sharp very early on. So if I saw anyone more in the pop world saying, this is the way, in my brain, I'd always be like, no, there's a whole other world over here that is very different, but has very different approaches that maybe we can learn from. So I was very motivated early on to try to open people's minds to alternative strategies that were possible, because I was surrounded by an example of that I just wasn't seeing being covered. So generally opening people's minds up to alternatives is a huge motivating factor for a lot of my writing and publishing now. And then, and so this doesn't only happen on the artist side. A lot of times also the music industry and the music industry media also leaves out the fan perspective a lot. So if you think about Okay, we already brought up crypto, so it's not completely out of left field, but crypto has been a super hyped up topic in the music industry and culture, obviously. And there's a lot of talk right now in music and crypto about there's not being that many collectors of music NFTs, for example, or music tokens. And a lot of people are like, what do fans actually want? Clearly nothing's resonating. And my follow-up response to that is always, why don't you just ask? Like very often I realize people are just speculating about what people might want without doing at least some kind of research or getting some kind of input. So for example, a piece that I edited recently, but that was conducted primarily by a lot of people in the community that I run now, Water and Music, was about the music Web3 fan journey. And it involved almost exclusively interviews with fans in music and crypto or collectors in music NFTs just to get their perspective and start that conversation. So that's not like an example necessarily of artists being left out of the conversation, but it's some voice being left out that is critical to getting an understanding of the full picture of what's actually happening in a way that can actually move the conversation forward and understanding what people actually want or what their needs are. So yeah, through my upbringing, definitely was very hyper aware of that from the artist side. And then as I kept writing about the industry, realized there are common gaps beyond just artists. Like very often the fan or customer perspective was left out of our industry facing coverage, for example.
Yeah, that's awesome. So as a journalist, do you feel like you have been treated differently for being an Asian American woman? Was it hard at the beginning, or did you always feel like you were evaluated as an individual?
I think, fortunately, because the field that I was in was so green, there wasn't that much precedent in terms of a large group of people focusing on this beat. If anything, I was treated differently in a positive way. So a lot of the other writers for music industry publications, especially ones focusing on tech, were older white men. I think that very much is still the case. So I think any signal people get of, a younger non-male person coming in and giving a take on how music and tech is evolving, I think that definitely helped. So yeah, I was very fortunate to be in that context. I'm just thinking the only pressure came from parents still being confused about what my job was. There was a very specific, like being treated differently in the cultural context. If my mom is trying to talk on WeChat about what I'm doing or something, like how I think she actually could talk about it a lot better now, which is great, but definitely starting out.
Was she confused about what you were doing?
Yeah, because a lot of my writing was pretty in-depth and meant for a niche audience. The one turning point, and I haven't done a really big spot like this since, but it was a turning point like 2018. I was asked to be on a CNBC interview and just give a very brief 10-minute interview about Spotify. I think they're about to go public or just got public. And that my parents understood. They're like, I know CNBC. Oh, I know about Spotify. Great. Okay, I'll like. So it's kind of like my very nice internal humble brag moment, I guess. All right, now we've reached that level of mutual understanding. But yeah, if there's any, not like conflict, but just confusion or tension of what I was doing, it was mostly coming from that source. Thankfully, externally in the industry, just because it was a pretty new field from a media perspective, I was able to carve out my own space in a positive way. I was also able to write pretty early on about a lot of groups like 88 Rising, for example, or there was a documentary called Bad Rap about the rise of Asian American rappers that came out around when I was just starting to freelance write more regularly. So 2015 to 2017. My background certainly helped in pitching myself as the person to write about that, also having context of how the music industry worked. So it's really cool to get to interview a lot of those rappers who were involved in that documentary or people on the 88 Rising team very early on and to see how they evolved. Yeah, so I'd say it's a situation where I'm definitely aware that I'm still very much minority in the space of music and tech in general. I think if you go to any events or in parallel with the tech industry in general, it's pretty male dominated. But being in a niche sector that was just like craving some new voice, it definitely has helped. Yeah.
Awesome. Since we're touching a little bit on 88 Rising and all of that, what's your thoughts on Asian American representation in music? I feel like we haven't quite gotten that representation yet. It's starting to happen in film, but...
I was just going to say, we're at a very interesting moment right now. As of recording this, we'll see what happens with shows like Beef. I know it's both doing really well, but there's also some backlash, controversy around it with, like how David Cho has been acting online and things he said in the past. But the fact that show has been so big and did really well, also on the backs of things like Everything Everywhere All at Once, which is probably the most transformative movie I've ever watched. It just affected me on a very personal level. It was really good. And then I guess Crazy Rich Asians being the marker for a lot of people of the beginning. Yeah, film, I think we're getting to a point where we're seeing a lot of really incredible stories with mostly Asian casts that aren't just about being Asian. That's an important part of a character's story, but isn't like the only reason to watch it, which is awesome. On the music side, we're just at the start of that. As of recording this, weekend one of Coachella just finished. And one of my favorite artists is Yeji, as she did her first Coachella set. I don't know if you know her. She's a more experimental electronic artist. She's definitely getting like more of her own following, very Asian American, from Queens, I believe. So big fan of her. I guess this is more North American, but Simu Liu, who's in everything right now, also just released a new single. Have you heard?
I didn't know that. No.
I'll
have to go check it out.
He has a lot going on. So he's going to be in the new Barbie movie. I feel like he has another project coming out, but he just released a new single and he's working with 88 Rising, I think. And it's very 2000s Disney ballad. It's very slow, down tempo, and like very emotionally affecting. I definitely listened to it multiple times when it first came out. But I pointed that as an example, though, of definitely one of the biggest, most recognizable Asian American, Asian Canadian stars who's putting art or music out there that has nothing to do with being Asian. He just happens to be Asian. He's just expressing himself or participating in the industry, which is really cool to see. But for sure, we're definitely in a much earlier stage of that process compared to film. And so in my last 2 years of college, and also a little bit after in freelance writing, I was really interested in following Asian American rap in particular, because the narrative that really took hold at the time and has only really started to crack now is that the last Asian American group to have a #1 single, and you'll have to fact check me on this, I'm pretty sure this is true, is Like a G6.
Oh, yeah.
By Far East Movement.
Yeah.
This was, oh my gosh, I totally forgot the year it was released, but it definitely was pre-college.
Yeah, it
was
2010, I want to say, around there.
Yeah, like around 2010. Yeah, okay, so almost like 15 years ago. Oh, it's so crazy.
Wow.
But yeah, that was playing on the radio and malls everywhere. That's my association with it. And then since that, there have been like a lot more Asian American rappers and hip hop artists who've come up who have done decently well. But for those who had mainstream ambitions, they just haven't hit the same level. If anything, if there's Asian representation on the charts, it's probably coming from K-pop or from adjacent groups. And that's also cool to see, but there are many layers to unpack there. There is still like an Asian American community of musicians who probably want to get signed to the same labels and have the same renown, but the international, very poppy, manufactured Eastern pop versions are dominating for now. But I mean, they have had international presence for a very long time. It's very, very nuanced. But I think that hopefully will contribute to people looking more kind of who's in the US, making similar stuff or maybe different stuff because of that intro to genres like K-pop. You're more open to exploring.
Yeah, I feel like especially for non-Asians, there's still a lack of distinction between Asian Americans and Asians. And I cannot tell you the number of times I've gone to a music conference and people ask me what kind of music I make, and they ask me if I make K-pop, even though I'm not even Korean.
Oh, no.
It's like there's this hurdle of they can't get over the fact that people who look like me have been here for a really long time. I don't know. And then I also found it very interesting that I think in 2020 or 2021, when Spotify did the big Asian American Heritage Month campaign, I logged on it and it was Asian American Heritage Month, but then it was all Asian genres.
Oh, wow.
I actually wrote a Medium article about it. Yeah. And I compared it to Apple Music because Apple Music actually had playlists that had Asian American artists, although most of them were mainstream people like Bruno Mars, who were technically Asian, like half Asian.
Yeah, I definitely know he's Asian, but he doesn't I don't know if he's ever talked about it. Or maybe I haven't.
He doesn't claim that. Yeah, so I thought it was a very interesting contrast between the two, how they approached it. Spotify was like, here's all the Asian genres. And I was like, I think that was not the point of this month, but okay.
Yeah. So I think going back to or comparing to film, I do think we're in a Crazy Rich Asians kind of moment for music in that if it's very outwardly Asian on a foreign level, K-pop, or similar genres from Asia, like the continent, then people are like, yes, it fits in this box of Asian music. So Far East Movement, they run their own agency now, and they collaborate with a lot of Asian American and Asian artists across the diaspora. And they have talked about struggles marketing themselves in the major label system in interviews because Asian Americans, technically, if you look at the numbers, are like a single digit percentage of the US population, I think. If you are thinking with a very traditional major label hat on, you look at that number and you're like, oh, this is not marketable. It's a very identity politics first approach to marketing music. This is only going to reach or resonate with a certain group of people. And I think they also talked about like, they just want to rap about anything, but there's a lot of pressure to keep the subject to maybe more stereotypically Asian things, which is almost feels like a losing cycle, I guess, in that system. So interestingly, I think there's a similar thing in Hollywood where Asian actors used to have a similar struggle. And so YouTube used to be known as Asian Hollywood because you'd have these Wong Fu productions I grew up on watching all their stuff, like all Asian kind of production crews who make their own things. And then now we're at this point, but it took a really, really long time to get there. I feel like music is doing a similar thing in an Asian American context where Asian American artists, like some are getting really big on the independent level. And they've either by choice or in the worst cases by force been out of the major label system and are building their own way of doing things. And I can feel the gap closing, but it's very early on still.
Yeah. I don't know if you're comfortable talking about this because this wasn't in the questions, but since we'd mentioned rap, are you comfortable talking a little bit about cultural appropriation? When is it appropriate for Asian Americans to be rapping?
Ooh. Yeah, I could talk about this. When is it appropriate for Asian Americans to be rapping? So I cannot say I am an authority on hip hop culture or what it is. And doing research on Asian Americans and hip hop, I definitely looked first to what the originators of hip hop would say, like Black communities, especially in New York, their thoughts on it. So I can talk about, I guess, what I found in that and like where I think problems come up. What I heard in a lot of conversations or debates is that to the extent that rap is about expressing yourself, I think a widely shared philosophy is that anyone can participate in the art form. Like anyone can rap, regardless of your background. Like you're Asian, if you're white, if you're Latin American. Yeah, like rap is just, it's a certain way of expressing yourself through art that has very different benefits, affordances from other genres. The moment it definitely becomes a problem is if in that process, you're cosplaying another culture. I think that's where it definitely becomes an issue. For example, there's a lot of debate around the concept of the Black accent. And if you're not Black, but you adopt an accent that makes you sound like you're Black, but it's not your authentic way of speaking, and there's very clearly a commercial incentive to like build this persona that is more marketable, that I see as an issue. But that's just like my personal stance. I think everyone has different stances on this. So to the extent that it helps with self-expression, I don't see rapping alone as cultural appropriation. I think it's about respecting history, like learning from it, being open to learning from it, seeing opportunities to like push the genre forward, and then also like just not disrespecting other people, which sounds simple. Obviously, there are so many complicated layers to this whole conversation. But yeah, doing the research and staying educated on what is and isn't okay. So one of the other things that I saw you mention was that you traveled to India and other parts of Asia as part of your work. You mentioned that it was important for you to understand the cultures in which people are interacting with the music and the technology that you cover. Can you talk a bit about why it is so important? What would you lose if you didn't go there and explore for yourself? Oh my gosh. I've learned through traveling that you do lose so much. There is definitely an assumption that you can just copy and paste some technology that works in one city, even like within the US or let alone a country, pour it over to another country and assume it'll work. In reality, I learned about a term that's more academic, but I reference all the time, called like technological solutionism or determinism, which is basically a stance that technology alone drives society forward, or like technology alone will solve all our problems. In reality, it's not that easy or not that simple. Like human society is a very, very messy thing. Coordinating humans is a very messy thing. I think that applies to culture and tech as well. For example, WeChat, perfect example. So many social and also commercial factors, like Tencent being such a dominant company, for example, in China, that make WeChat possible and make it the app that allows you to do literally anything. Like it's a social platform, it's a payment platform, it's a blogging platform. There's like WeChat Plus or something, I think. It's really everything. And every time I think Facebook may have said something recently, or Elon may have said something recently about Twitter of, we're trying to make the next WeChat for social media. But like having a very US-centric audience, I always squint a little bit. Do you know? What are you actually saying? And are you actually going to try to just impose all these features on us without thinking critically through, like, is this actually how people behave culturally on the ground? To give a music example, to go back to K-pop, of course, K-pop now has a super global fan base, and a lot of fans around the world are tapped into this very specific way of producing pop and performing it. There have been some attempts in the US in the last 5 to 10 years to create homegrown K-pop style groups. There'll be like US-based training camps and audition processes, and trying to get to the same result through a very similar, if not identical process, but on just completely different turf.
Yeah.
In a completely different cultural landscape. And I think there's a reason why most of those initiatives have not succeeded. It's a very simplistic copy and paste formulaic attempt to recreate the success of something, which in music, this is, I guess, depending on who you're talking to, it's the best or the worst part of working in the music industry is that it's like rarely ever cookie cutter. There's rarely ever something you can truly replicate in terms of success. It also means that there's so much flexibility to experiment. In India, a lot of macro level factors. So one, just the chaos of daily life and what that means in terms of people's preferences for media consumption. Like you really do not know until you're like viscerally there feeling it. And then also, of course, the financial situation for a lot of people there, like their ability or lack thereof to pay for a subscription, like other things that they're thinking about. In other markets, do they even have a credit card? Do they want to use a credit card to pay for this? A lot of those day-to-day behavioral and financial elements impact how fast or how realistically a service like Spotify, for example, can grow in these markets. Yeah, you very often only see the top level numbers in terms of consumption or revenue in those markets without diving into like the cultural and also like commercial competitive nuances of why something might be challenging to adopt in those areas.
I think it was on your podcast, you were talking to somebody from India and they were talking about the languages being the determining factor as to what music people listen to, which is very unique to India, I feel like, as far as I know.
Yeah, we just ran our first paid course at Water Music about global music rights. And I'm glad you found that podcast because this theme actually came up again in this course. So for this course, we brought in people from around the world working in music rights. So people from India, China, Latin America, West Africa, all of which have very different landscapes for music copyright and music tech adoption, to give a rundown for attendees on why it was so complicated in all those respective markets in different ways. And this issue came up of, great example. The number may have been 20. It's like a few dozen officially recognized dialects in India spoken across the country. What that basically means is that you cannot rely on the network effects that you might expect from, say, an English language song in the US. Obviously, very different scale of like population and country, but like there is going to be a language barrier at a level that you just do not see, do not expect. So how you market a given artist to meet people where they're at in terms of marketing is fundamentally different. So yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah. So being a journalist nowadays, it's a pretty tough business. And yet you figured out a way to create a working style for you that is both lucrative and creatively fulfilling. So tell us about Water and Music and how it grew from your newsletter to the business it is today.
Yeah, I realized I didn't give a proper intro on what Water Music is. Water and Music started just as a side free newsletter where I aggregated my freelance writing. That was like the initial function. If you want to follow me, here's a central place where you can receive a regular update of all the articles I write directly in your inbox. Very quickly, it expanded into a more flexible sandbox for me to explore random ideas or kind of fringe ideas in music and tech that wouldn't fit neatly in any of the publications I was covering. For example, very early on, I was into the idea of digital scarcity for music, what that actually looks like and why there wasn't a scarcity-driven model around digital music. Is that even possible in the streaming world? So a lot of those more theoretical but very relevant conversations, the Water Music Free newsletter, which is my place to thought dump. Thankfully, there's an audience for that. A community started growing around like-minded people who were also interested in that kind of feature thinking about the industry. So it grew up to a point where in early 2019, I decided to launch a Patreon around the newsletter just to see what would happen. Do people find this perspective valuable? Do they want to meet other people who are thinking the same way? Because a newsletter is still ultimately one directional, right? It's just me to one person. Readers can't meet each other unless there's a dedicated space for that. So I juggled that paid membership experience with continuing to freelance for around a year. So it definitely wasn't an overnight switch. But then come early 2020, I was not only able to make the switch to working on Water Music full-time because it had grown to enough members for me to support that, but it was also a crazy time for the world. It was just the start of the pandemic. It's so surreal to think back to that time and also how much time has passed and how much has changed, but also not changed.
Yeah.
But like that year, the music industry in particular was in a crisis because the entire live industry had essentially been decimated. And on the artist level, people realized that there was no good financial alternative in a digital world to the income that so many artists got from touring. It was a very desperate scramble to try to experiment with whatever tools are possible in digital space. So live streaming, virtual concerts got a ton of hype, in-game concerts. I think actually Patreon had one of their biggest growth years that year because a lot of artists were trying to launch memberships, a lot of venues to support themselves. More artists than ever still today are launching Discord servers, just a lot of experimentation and curiosity about tech that meant that suddenly the number of things to write about from my side just completely ballooned. So it fortunately drew a lot more people to the community and got people a lot more curious and woke them up to the importance of following this part of the industry. So thankfully we got a lot more growth then. I started hiring my first team members then, brought in a community manager and a research assistant who have been super invaluable. And so, yeah, we saw a lot of growth through that period. And then in the last year and a half, I've been expanding it into another phase of doing a lot more collaborative research projects. I had this kind of realization that for a lot of innovation research in particular, so much activity is happening in like the very, very long tail of the random developer or artist at home, which is experimenting and getting very scrappy with certain technology in a way that is not going to be captured by a central mainstream media source. So it's going to be harder to capture that. And there are lots of opportunities to lean on methods of crowdsourcing data, crowdsourcing information to get a better picture of what's happening in the market. So yeah, a lot of the last year and a half has been trying to, I guess, two things. One, trying to figure out what that process looks like of crowdsourcing data for like research on tech innovation. And then also expanding our offerings beyond just articles. Our bread and butter is still like articles and kind of the community around them. But we also have education, like this paid course I just mentioned. And then we also are expanding a lot more into IRL events, just as a community benefit. I guess once this episode comes out, we will have hosted our first summit, our first music tech conference in New York at the beginning of May. But then we also have a lot of local events in cities around the world where our members are active. We've done events in New York, London, Miami, and Washington, D.C. And we're slowly expanding that as well.
That's amazing. Do you have any advice for any budding journalists who might be listening?
Okay, as of recording this today, it's a really weird moment for the media industry. The latest news example being BuzzFeed just shut down their entire news section. I don't know if you saw this.
I didn't see that.
They fired like 150 people. Their COO and one of the other C-suite execs are leaving the company.
Wow.
And this is months, just a few months after they announced that they were going to publish more AI-generated articles. And they've already started experimenting with AI-generated travel guides and listicles, which like, of course, if you think about the BuzzFeed formula for articles, yeah, like that is a definition of formulaic. So I lead with that. That said, I also use AI tools in my creative process every day, and I actually love it. And I'd like to think I'm a better creator for it. So I'm not a totally doomsday person, but I lead with that example because it's a very different time compared to 2015 when I first started to be entering a world of media where if big companies, especially in a bear market, can automate something, they will do it. Then the question becomes, what cannot be automated? Like what kind of expertise is still super valuable? I can only speak from my direct experience, so it's definitely is biased by that. But my mental model has come to niche domain expertise and this being a really good time to be a specialist. I know there's a debate of is now the time to be a generalist or a specialist. I think specialist knowledge of one particular area will really serve you well. And especially if getting niche knowledge in a certain domain has to happen in part socially through building a community of like-minded people who also have a similar off-kilter, very niche interests and fostering that knowledge and building value around that specific knowledge that won't be captured in the same way, at least in my opinion, with a large-scale generative AI model like GPT-4 or GPT-10, whatever comes out. So that was my first piece of advice for budding journalists. Definitely put yourself out there and early on, try out whatever gigs you can get, but definitely start to ask very early on what's something that you're super passionate about and that there will always be a story about. So actually one of the few Patreon memberships I'm still on is for a writer who just writes about ambient music and has built a career on really good criticism on ambient music. And somehow every year there's some story that actually like the expertise is really good. I think in the last year or so, there was a huge anniversary for Brian Eno for one of his big albums. And so like that, she like wrote a lot of really good pieces for that. Yeah, like in today's world, I'm not on TikTok, but especially in today's TikTok world, truly nothing is too niche. If you find something you're really interested in and are consistent in publishing and exploring it and consistently put yourself out there and put your unique voice out there, I do believe you will find a like-minded community and be able to build something stable around that. That at least has been my experience. And I can see a lot of opportunities for that kind of experience, especially in other fields in entertainment. I feel like I would pay for a specific niche publication focused on the gaming industry or music and gaming. Gaming was definitely something that like came up for me during the pandemic, is something that I became super passionate about, but I haven't really seen people, I haven't seen it at the publication level, people really dive into that. As an example, free idea for anyone who may be listening.
So we talked a little bit about ChatGPT and AI, and that's the latest buzzword. Everybody's talking about it. Everybody's freaking out about it. Do you really think that we're going to get to the point where even maybe BuzzFeed would, but other publications where they would truly automate the whole thing? Because I feel like as humans, we are very good at detecting patterns. And I feel like humans will quickly learn to distinguish between this is a ChatGPT generated article versus this is an article that somebody actually took the time to research and write and edit and make it personable, something like that. So do you agree with that, or?
One of my life taglines that I've started to say to myself again and again, but it applies to this question, is it's all about the incentives. I don't think Bloomberg, for example, or like the New York Times will ever get to a point of automating any part of their publication. Because especially the New York Times, if they're in the business of hard-hitting journalism and reporting facts and investigative reporting, there's very good documentation of how the output of these models, they have no gauge for what is the most or least factual. They're just like spitting out what is the next best prediction, right? They're emulating information, but there's no signal of whether it's true. Like it's definitely not a substitute for fact checking. So any business that requires fact checking for their business to be robust, so big metro papers, I think they probably will not automate that process. That said, I do know, so there are some media publications that are starting to publish their stances on AI and in organizational context, like how they'll use it or not. Wired is an example where I think they said that they will never publish any pieces with AI generated content, but they may use AI to brainstorm headlines, for example. So that's an area where if you're trying to generate a lot of ideas in a short amount of time for synthesizing large amounts of information in a way that resonates with some audience, as a brainstorming tool, I think it's completely makes sense. And that's actually how I use it a lot in my day-to-day too. Whereas, CNET, the tech reviews site, they, like BuzzFeed, also have been very aggressively pushing AI-generated content. Their business model is not on facts. I don't think their business model is more on affiliate revenue, pointing to products that generate revenue when you click on their links. So their goal is to maximize your surface area so that most people click on their links. So if that's the incentive, then they're going to want to automate as much of that generation process as possible. So I think it all just breaks down to incentives and what a publication is actually trying to do at the end of the day. I don't think there'll be a uniform formula across the board in terms of like where AI fits in.
Yeah, I feel like it's going to become a tool like Grammarly, right? People will use it in their workflow to speed up some things, but it's very unlikely to replace the humans altogether, except in those very rare cases where they really don't care about fact checking.
Yeah, exactly.
One of your latest articles mentioned deepfakes of popular artists and their voices and all the licensing issues and stuff that comes with that. Do you think that voice training datasets will become the new merch that people sell to their fans and kind of bypass that licensing issue?
Maybe not to fans, but to creative collaborators. This definitely is already happening. I think the best example of this is an artist named Holly Herndon. She's a really good TED Talk, like actual TED Talk, on her making her own voice model, Holly Plus. It's a closed model, but she's licensed it to a few dozen creative collaborators in just her orbit. And as part of the deal, she gets a revenue share of songs that use that model to generate some aspect of the instrumentation. And it's like everything's above board. That model just works for her because I think her goal is to just establish upfront this culture of consent. Here's my voice model. You can use it. That's awesome. I'm very curious to see how you impersonate me. As long as I get a cut of the value generated, that's totally cool. Yeah, it's not so much merch, but as a creative tool, it's almost like selling instruments on Splice. So I see it at maybe like first in terms of how artists use it practically, maybe more paralleling the economy that we're seeing on Splice, like artist packs, like voice packs for sure. I totally see that being a thing. That said, even like the vocal deep fake songs that are coming out today, those were not generated with a Mid-Journey style tool where you just write in a text prompt and it outputs an image. It still requires a lot of hands-on production. Like you need to know how to use a DAW, like Logic or Ableton. You still need to know how to produce beats under the voice. So there's still a long way to go in terms of accessibility before maybe the merch analogy will really kick in. But the voice as like a artificial creative tool or resource that you can sell to other artists, for sure. I think there are some individual case studies to artists already doing that. And I think it makes sense at the platform level for that to be a next step for some of these companies like Splice. Yeah.
Awesome. We like to end the interview with rapid fire questions. These are short one word or one phrase answers. You don't have to explain, but you can if you want to.
Cool. Let's do it.
Okay. So what's an Asian food that you should like but don't?
The red bean dessert things that is served a lot at Chinese restaurants.
Me too.
It's not one word. I totally forgot the name, but you may have had it before. I just don't like it. Like the sweet red bean stuff.
Yeah. I don't know the name either, but I agree with you.
Not a fan.
What's an Asian food that you'll never get tired of?
Never get tired of. The long shrimp rice wrap noodle things. It's like a dim sum.
Yeah. I know what you mean. I don't know what it's called.
I also don't know the names of any of these, but I just had it at a dim sum dinner the other week. Anyway, shrimp wrapped in rice noodles and dipped in like really good soy sauce.
Yes.
Never get tired of it.
Excellent.
Really good.
Most overrated and most underrated music technology out there today.
Okay, I'm going to start with underrated. Most underrated music technology. I do think there isn't enough attention put on merch. I feel like there are lots of really cool things that could be done with merch and campaigns around merch that has not really been explored, just because I guess if you look at the aggregate numbers, it's not like a huge priority. But usually if there's a really cool, weird campaign an artist does, it involves some kind of merch. So it's underrated in that it's like underexplored, I think. So I'd love to see more about that. Overrated? I feel like I'm like in the business of always being curious about new tech. So I'm like always afraid to ask this question. But I do know every 3 years, there's a cycle of a new group of companies trying to put music rights on the blockchain. And I'm like very not convinced by that. Or it's so challenging on the scale of will take 5 to 10 years to solve for reasons that like every 2 to 3 years, people always forget. Just like no institutional memory just held over that period. And then a new crop of people come in who are excited about the industry, which is great. But hopefully, even in a small way, again, through like writing that I and other people in Modern Music put out, we'll start to have some kind of documentation of, if you're going to try this, look at all the other attempts that have been tried and learn from their mistakes or like opportunities for improvement. And just try to establish that culture. Overrated in that it's a really interesting and important problem, but the challenge is just so immense to a level that I think people don't realize. Rights on the blockchain. That's my answer.
Who's your favorite journalist?
My favorite journalist.
Or maybe a journalist who's inspiring you right now, if that's easier.
I have so much respect for Taylor Lorenz. She's a internet culture journalist, wrote a lot for the New York Times, broke a lot of big culture stories for them, especially around TikTok. Now writes for the Washington Post. She not only is consistently early to almost every culture trend story, but has dealt with so much online in terms of people just harassing her or being reply guys on Twitter. And how she's dealt with it has been very just consistently diplomatic, but also very assertive. Like, no, I'm doing my job. Her beat also is one that a lot of people laughed at for a very long time. Like, why is internet culture something you should care about? Like, why is Vine something you should care about? I think she was very early to covering that. But obviously now I think in terms of platforms and trends that are impacting society at large, it's one of the most important beats to know. So shout out to Taylor. Right. Followed her for a very long time.
And lastly, what is your favorite piece you've written so far?
Oh, I have an immediate answer to this. I think 5 years ago, I wrote a piece for NPR trying to plot the future of music listening. So the context was most streaming services now look and operate in the same way. It's all the same songs.
Yeah.
Yes, there's some difference in features, but you can like have playlists. It's like there hasn't been that much like actual innovation, in my opinion, in the streaming world in a very long time. So I was trying to think through, what's the next innovation going to look like? And there are a lot of interesting elements to explore there, like kind of adaptive AI generated music. Like what if it could adapt to your environment or your mood? What would that look like? Or there are a lot of fitness apps that can integrate with your health app, like Apple Health, and use that as inputs. That's really fascinating. So I was exploring that for this piece, but I formatted the piece as an exchange of letters with myself 40 years in the future. So it was like creative, a mix of like speculative fiction, but also I interviewed a lot of founders for that piece. So it was like creative fiction or fiction, but informed by things that were happening today as a way to map out what might happen. I've never done anything like that since, but I've wanted to explore similar ideas of creatively mapping out the future, but based on facts, like actual things that are happening right now. Yeah, I think it's called What's the Far Future of Music Listening on NPR Music, if you want to read it.
Yeah, I'll put a link to it.
But that's like definitely the weirdest piece I've written, but it's been the most fun to revisit, especially with all the AI stuff going on right now.
Yeah. I'll put a link to it in the show notes.
Awesome. Thank you.
I'm just going to put this out there. I feel like you should pitch this for like an Apple TV Plus show or something.
Oh, like that? Ooh. Yeah, maybe. If not a show, a Black Mirror episode. I don't know if they're doing more seasons of that, but I think it would fit very well. Yes.
Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. It was a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, likewise.
Here are our takeaways for today's episode. Number 1. While it's great to have dreams, it's important to make sure you understand what that career entails so you can make an informed decision on whether you truly want to commit to it 100%. In Cherie's case, she realized that she didn't really want to be a full-time musician and decided to study statistics instead. Number 2, being unapologetically yourself can help you stand out and carve out a niche for yourself. Cherie did so by combining her stats background, her music industry knowledge, and interest in culture into an important beat. Number 3, when starting out, you can create win-win situations by partnering with other stakeholders who are also just starting out, like Cherie did by interviewing startup founders who were looking for press coverage. Number 4, when trying to understand trends, it's helpful to ask whose perspective is being left out and whether that information could move the conversation forward or help you solve any problems. Number 5, ChatGPT can seem like it's coming for all of our jobs at first, but it has its flaws. It cannot distinguish fact from fiction, for example. AI will likely transform most jobs in some way, but the key is to find out what human skills are irreplaceable. In many cases, we're likely to use AI as a tool to brainstorm ideas or automate boring or low-impact tasks. But there's still other things that we'll need humans for, at least in the near future. Number 6, in the age of AI, anything that can be automated will be automated. If you're unsure how AI will affect your job, a look at your company's incentives might offer some clues. Be sure to check Cherie's article that I linked in the show notes. As always, you will find the definitions, takeaways, and links in the show notes on your podcast app or at nuancespod.com. If you enjoyed this conversation, you know what to do. Send it to a friend. For other ways to support the podcast, go to nuancespod.com/support. Next week, we will be talking to Dr. Manoj Moradian. She is the author of the book This Flame Within, Iranian Revolutionaries in the United States. We have a fascinating conversation about Iran-US relations pre- and post-1979, anti-colonial movements across the diasporas in the 70s, and what gives her hope for the current Iranian revolution. It's a great interview. I hope you won't miss it. Again, I'm your host, Lazu, and I'll be back next week for another nuanced conversation. Thanks for listening.